So you know that I teach piano, mostly in Montgomery County. Mostly I deal with students in K-12 space. I've had a couple, you pick up a parent here and there who wants to, resume studying. I teach mostly piano. I don't teach percussion. Once in a great while, I'll get someone who actually wants to do composition. So that's kind of what we're going to get at. Perfect, thank you. So what I'd like to know, since I don't know who's here, how many people here today are teaching either a chunk or primarily in the K-12 space? How many people have a lot of K-12 students? And are most of you guys one-to-one, or are you working in a classroom?
Classroom, school.
So a little bit of both, okay. And then, are most of your students primarily for, like in the one-to-one space, are you working primarily with folks who are there for their instrument, or if you have a vocal studio, who are there for their instrument or voice, or are you actually focused on composition in your studios? Anybody focused on composition, or are you mostly there for your instrument? Students there for their instrument?
Mostly whatever instrument.
Right. So that is my experience as well. And I think it's a pretty common one. How many folks have students that you're working with who are already there to do composition, or maybe who aren't already there to do composition, but they're messing around, they're dabbling, they're improvising, or maybe they're doing some kind of activity that's like composition adjacent, even if they're not really intentional about what they're doing. So yeah. And then has anybody ever used improvisation or like a composition adjacent activity, something that's part of the process, to teach music theory? Right. So, and we can be talking about, harmonic progression, but even just, listening for meter or some other ear training, or, notation skills, learning to write down your notes if you have someone at the, right? So these are things that, especially if you're working in the K-12 space, that I like to focus on, because there's a lot of utility there, even if your students are not telling you that they're interested in composition. You can do stuff that will kind of show them that this is an option. And maybe you can get a little bit more, I'm gonna flip back to this microphone. People can still hear me, I assume? Yeah. Okay, great, because now I have to move slides. So what I wanna look at first, because, oh God, I need to just get rid of this box here. Great, now I can see what I'm doing. What I want to talk about first is stuff that we probably already know, so I'm going to blow through this really fast. I'm working a lot with students who are either in early elementary grades or mostly in middle school. Sometimes I'm lucky and I get one that continues all the way through high school. I just graduated a kid last year and he's a freshman at UVA now, majoring in something like biomechanical engineering or something like that. But there's a big difference if you're not working with a lot of young kids. There's big differences between how a student is when they're in early elementary grades and once they get above, say, 5th grade. So to just go through this really fast, if you have really young kids in your studio, you know that you're working with really small chunks of content. Their music that they're learning is really basic form and structure, but if you have older kids, whether or not they're beginners, they're capable of taking on pieces that have more in them. If you're working with really young students, you're not going to send them home to go do a lot of stuff on their own that you haven't carefully presented to them and given them a lot of support to practice learning it. Their practice is not going to be very independent. And in my world, the more it's like playtime, the happier I am, because that's easy for them to do and it's really motivating for them to do. But once we get above 5th grade, I can start asking a student to take more responsibility for that part of their learning. We learn how to structure their practice time. I can maybe start to flip their lesson and tell them, hey, you bring me this new material already under your fingers, and then we can start to do the real work on learning the music. If you have studied, cognitive development theory of children and, Jean Piaget, we talk about the the early elementary years are what we would call kind of a concrete operational space, where, they're there, they can do processes, but they're not really abstracting. They're not bringing a lot of logic and abstraction to a problem, so we're not going to ask them to do a lot of complicated things on their own. From just, the skills of playing their instrument, if they're young, they're probably more beginner, and they're learning to play the instrument. But if they're older, even if they're a beginner, I can start to bring in more of that connection between physically playing the instrument and the thought about interpreting the music that they're playing. Hey, if I play the key this way and it gives me this sound as a pianist, what does that do to the story that I'm communicating when I play this piece? I can't do too much of that with a really young student. So let me step aside over here to this other completely different thing. I did not invent this, and this did not actually come from anything that I encountered in a music education or arts education space. This came from a textbook that was for training and development managers in corporate workspaces, which is a different part of my life. And the guy that said this, his name is Dan Pontefract, and I don't remember what he does, but I remember when I saw those three things in bullet points, I thought, oh wow, something I actually care about as a music teacher. So he was talking about different mindsets that you can have in your work and how they might affect your performance as an employee and how as a manager you might want to cultivate that. In my world, in our world, if I'm thinking about where a student is at, if I'm thinking about all of these things as kind of ingredients and components of composing, creative thinking might be just purely experimenting with sounds. Either a kid's gonna just roam free on the keyboard or, blow air through a horn and make sound, or maybe they have a springboard, a rhythm cell, a motive, something that they're working with. Maybe you have, a game that you're interacting with, but you're just, kind of experimenting with transforming sound into something else. If you were here yesterday and you heard Aaron's talk when he was talking about convergent and divergent kind of ways of approaching composition, that really resonated with me as being similar to this kind of thought. I think of critical thinking, that bucket of Mr. Pontefract's, I think of that as being analogous to the music theory aspect of learning music and learning composition. And I think of it as, kind of getting the tools and the vocabulary and getting, a sense of what you can do as part of the writing process. If you have a 10 to 15-year-old student, if you have a middle school or a high school student, that's the space that you're living in. Everybody can pretty much do the creative thinking part. Sometimes the younger students are more confident. They're not really old enough to know fear. My goal a lot of the time is to get an older student and even an adult student to keep that flowing. But then once I get above 5th grade, we're living in the yellow box, because now I've got a student who can take that on, who I can start to teach you music theory in a really structured way. I can sort of give you a bunch of tools. And if you're already there thinking about making songs, then I've got a great, kind of situation to work with. But if you're not, as a student, if you're coming in and you're there to play your instrument, those opportunities are still there. And maybe, I'm going to get lucky and one's going to present itself, but I can also usually manufacture a moment when I'm teaching music theory. I can choose an activity that is part of the composition process to illustrate, hey, you can make original music, and, at least get them thinking about the possibility and whether or not that's something that they're interested in doing. So in order to do this and be successful, kind of the first step is to assess, who is the student? Who am I working with? And in the space of instructional design, right, if you make curriculum but you're not a teacher, This process of learner analysis and really getting a sense of who my student is super important to do really carefully. If you're a teacher, we kind of just do it, right? It's really easy to do in a one-to-one space because I have a lot of interaction with this student and I can really kind of get to know where they're at. If I'm working in a classroom, it's a little bit more complicated because I don't have just one learner. I have to think about the range of capabilities in the room, the range of interests in the room, and what I'm going to do to address that and support that in the way that gets me to where I want to be and the way that gets the students to something that's really meaningful. So if I'm in a classroom situation, I actually really have to think about this. But if I'm working one-to-one, you can kind of just do it intuitively. But sometimes it's really helpful to think through the process because you can miss, right? You can take a guess about something that's going to work with a student, or a student can bring something into a lesson. We can be kind of reactive, right? We can just respond to what they give us, and we do the first thing that occurs to us that might work, and then sometimes it doesn't work, and then we have to correct. So a lot of times, the more work you do to kind of get a sense of your learner up front, the more likely you are to hit with what you're going to try to do. So if I walk through this process of learner analysis, I can start with the basics, right? How old is my student? Where are they at technically? And then I can start to look at some, I can gradually start to get into more detail. So what are they interested in? Is this kid here to play all classical all the time? Do they play classical when I make them play classical? Have they ever, played a lead sheet? Do they play by ear? Then I can start thinking about, some more like subjective things. When I say is a student self-directed or needs support, what I'm thinking about is how much is this student going to take initiative on their own? How much do I need to give them guidance about what to practice, how to practice, how many times to repeat a practice? Oh, you didn't tell me that I should stop at measure 9, so I went all the way to the end of the song and accumulated a bunch of errors. Or you didn't tell me to go, as far as measure 16, even though we didn't play past measure 9 in the lesson, so I didn't practice the new stuff at home. How much do I need to support and direct a student? And then also things like, what do they notice? Is this a student who's really observant of structural elements, or are they observant of other things in the music? Do they notice melodic gesture? Do they notice, phrase structure, or do they kind of notice mood? So, how do they tend to interact with a piece of music? I have these 2 questions here that, when I want to deal with composition, are really important for me to think about up front. One is, does this kid improvise? Have I seen any indication that they're gonna improvise? And if they don't, do they not because they want that guidance, they need the structure, they need the support and the direction, hey, you should try this, and then they'll try it? Or are they maybe fear inhibited? Both of them can be happening at the same time, but whatever is primarily in front of me, you're going to address those 2 situations different ways. And, we probably all have our own kind of go-to approaches for how to deal with a kid who's fear inhibited versus, I think sometimes a kid who needs a lot of direction is almost easier to deal with. But that's one thing that I like to think about up front. And then these other 3 words on the bottom, painter and sculptor and engineer, that's just, those are my buckets that I tend to think about. If I'm just going to put this student into a broad group, which one are they? What type of animal are they? Engineer's kind of the easiest to define. Maybe this is someone who really notices structure. This might be the kind of student that would do well with a lot of pre-composition, working from an outline. To me, painter and sculptor, I see these as like ways that I observe how they interact with the repertoire they're learning. A student that's really melodically oriented likes to go in a long, straight line. I might think of as more of a painter because they tend to think in things that would kind of flow into one another. Whereas a sculptor, maybe they're really disorganized in their practicing. They're chunking on something over here, they're chunking on something over there, but it all comes together. Or maybe they tend to work in little kind of blocks and build that. There's, overlap between all of these categories, but they're just useful for me. So if you have, language that's useful to you, just some way to think about how your students are interacting with the repertoire they're learning and how that might be reflected in how they would approach a composition or an improv type activity that you would do. So this is this kind of learner analysis phase. So I have the improviser here. I thought it might be useful to look at kind of a sample student. I don't think this is a real student that I taught. So let's say we have a 12-year-old pianist. They're at an early intermediate level of technique. So I'm going to say, if anybody speaks piano, I'm going to call that, maybe one of the Clementi sonatinas, some of the easier pieces from the Schumann album for the young, that type of stuff. This kid doesn't sight sing because I haven't done any ear training with them in their piano lesson. For whatever reason, it's not a good thing, but it happens a lot. They tend to notice structural elements of their songs, of their repertoire, probably because I've been teaching them to do that since the very beginning. And they like to play pop music, but they're stapled to the score. They need an arrangement. They need sheet music. They want to see every note written out. They're not going to do it by ear. However, they mess around. They tell me, their parents tell me, oh, I played the piano, but I didn't play this. I got tired of playing this. I wasn't interested in playing this. I didn't really have enough time to do work on it, but I did play some piano. That's an opportunity. That's an opportunity for me that presented itself. I didn't have to work for it, and I have a lot of things that I can do. So I'm going to break this down a little bit. Enjoy playing pop music, likes sheet music, and they mess around. I can use existing materials. I can give them something that's written out, and I can start to strip it down, or I can start to transform it with the student until it's a new piece of music. And they've participated in making a new piece of music. I like to use lead sheets if a student is sufficiently advanced. So let me look at the first one first. This is a piece of music that maybe you can see a little, maybe you cannot. We don't see a cursor on that screen, do we? No, we do. No, only in the bottom, but not. It doesn't move around in the slide. It's not moving around in the middle of the music here. Okay, darn it. Well, hopefully you can see that, and hopefully you can read any of those notes. This is from an advanced beginner book from the Faber Piano Adventure series, and I chose that series for this source because even if you don't love it and use it, you probably know about it because it's so much of what's out there. So there's a 12-bar blues in C major. And if a student can play this off the page, I can start to ask them to do little tiny things. I can start to ask them to take that one-note bass line and elaborate it. If they have never done this before, I might ask them to just play a stomp, like a fifth, sixth kind of stomp. If they've, got a little bit more dexterity in their left hand or a little more advanced, we might try for a walk. If they're inhibited and they're afraid to kind of, go for that, then I might just ask them to make a transition in the fourth bar and walk from that C chord to that 4 chord. Just one thing that you can do to get started. We might replace a motive with a different motive, or we might, if that's too much, we might replace a motive by inverting it or doing something else to it just to change it up a little bit. And the idea is that a student's going to make a choice about something to do with this piece of music. If they can handle changing a motive, then maybe they can improvise the second 4 bars. And we can start to build this up little by little until I've abstracted it down to the 12-bar blues without any of this scotch tape to the music, and now the kid can play the blues. And then maybe the kid can write the blues. So again, they don't have a ton of ear training, but they observe structural elements and they like playing pop music. So let's talk about maybe using a lead sheet. Lead sheets support ear training because even if this kid doesn't sight sing, they've got a melody that's written out and a chord that's handily labeled for them, and we can start to talk about the connection between the melody note and the chord. So I can do a lot of things. I can ask them, hey, instead of the first note that's in this chord that's shown, let's replace it with a different note from the chord. Or let's change the chord to a different chord that has the same note. And we can start to transform that process, and then they can start to edge their way into composition by manipulating a lead sheet. If I have an improviser, I can ask them to improvise. I can ask them to freely improvise, maybe while I play the chords. They don't have to be responsible for managing both things at the same time. And if they take their melody in the wrong direction, they're going to hear it right away when it doesn't sound right. And then we can talk about what happened and why that happened and how to address that. Maybe they're not a free improviser, but we can start by transforming the melody. We can make variations, but we can work in a bigger way than we would do with, say, the little Captain Hook blues there. So this Bye Bye Blackbird is a lead sheet that I like to work with very much as a first time out of the gate. It's not the only one I use, but it's got a dead simple melody, and it doesn't have any really scary chords. It's in a really easy key for piano students to deal with. It's actually in a really easy key for a lot of instruments to deal with. And you can absolutely jam out on it for 10 minutes without anybody getting bored if you know what you're doing. So there's a lot of things that I can do even with a simple tune like this. So last thing with the improviser, if you've been doing this for a while, we can get them to write down their own lead sheet, or we can get them to transcribe something that I can ask them to record their improvisation, and we can talk about transcribing it, or I can ask them to transcribe off the radio. And if I'm transcribing, from YouTube, or, we don't even have to transcribe with strict notation. I've done a lot with rhythm charts because you can, just sort of see the structure of the song, see the chords. They've already got the melody. That's kind of depending on a kid with more ear training. But, there's the choice of what to do is kind of between you and the student in front of you, right? So that's my kind of approach to this process of learner. And then, okay, I have a goal. What do I want this kid to do? And then choosing an activity that's going to get there. So some folks are helpfully going to hand out a piece of paper so that we can actually do a thing. Because in a workshop, I kind of feel like we should do a thing. And because I wanted this, these are the most boring slides you've ever seen, but I really wanted things to be large and readable. So unfortunately, we only see the first 2 steps of this process on this slide. If I start with a learner profile, then I pick a goal. What do I want this kid to do? And then there's a question that I ask, how many steps does it take to get there? So if I have a student and I want them to play the 12-bar blues, for example, how close are they to being able to do that? Do I need all of those intermediate steps that I described with Captain Hook, or are they pretty close to being able to just go for it on their own? So if I pick a goal, how many steps are there to get there? If I can't do this in 1 or 2 lessons, I probably want to establish some milestones, some intermediate points, because I want to be able to measure success. I want to be able to get from point A to point B. Pardon?
5 minutes.
Okay, great. Fairly quickly. And then I want to be able to, have a student see that they've done this short achievable war. After I've done that, I can choose an activity. What's my process? And these are questions that I'm going to ask here. So here's a sample student. I have misnamed him the engineer. Is that 5 minutes to talk or 5 minutes to do this whole activity? Okay, great. I've misnamed this student the engineer because this is a real kid, and I think of him as this way, but that's based on how he interacted with the music he was learning, as opposed to what he was actually doing when he would compose. This is a kid who told me he wants to compose, and he would improvise, but he would be stuck in a 4-chord loop. 4 chords, 4/4, 4 beats per chord, arpeggios over the top, all day, every day. Okay?
That's rock and roll.
Hey, well, actually, in his case, it was very lounge music. And that was his comfortable space. And if I tried to take him too far out of that comfortable space too quickly, it stopped being fun. And then he didn't want to do it anymore. So that was me missing. That was me guessing wrong because I said, oh, here's a kid that wants to compose. How am I going to teach this kid all of the wonderful things that you can do when you're composing? And what I really needed to do was give him some more tools and let him get there on his own. So if you have this student, that was it. If you have this student, what might you do with this student? I've got this learner profile. He's 15. He, comes from another instrument. His hands are a mess, so I can't, right? Clarinet hands on the piano. And he will absolutely go off on his own, so I probably want to give him some guidelines. But now I want to choose a goal and I want to choose an activity. So just yell. Does anybody have something in mind that you might want to do with a student like this?
Teach him the fifth chord.
Teach him a fifth chord. He knows all the chords. He only uses them in patterns of 4. So,
well, give him something in 3, like have him play with like set the metronome, or give him like a beat in 3 or something.
Yeah, that was one that actually did work. We did it successfully, and anybody with a different activity, or should we? Okay.
Ask for an 8-bar sequence.
So an 8-bar sequence where the phrase is 8 bars, or an 8-bar sequence where it's 2 times through your loop?
I need 8 different chords.
And how are we going to support getting to that 5th and 6th and 7th and 8th chord?
Sorry, I missed the question.
How will you support him to construct that 8-bar sequence? Because he's not naturally going to do it. Is that an answer or a different idea? Please.
Move one finger at a time in your chords.
So now you're voice leading your chords,
Yeah.
which is super. And actually one of the things, that was hard. And this happened during peak pandemic over Zoom. So the ability to support that was challenged by the technology. But that was, back.
I was just going to say, you could provide the chords and let them come up with a melody.
Yeah, that didn't work. Gray shirt.
They can do 4 chords, but they can't all be the same duration.
So getting that cadence pattern, that was how we got our 5th chord.
Oh.
Right? Because I told him the cadence had to have a different harmonic rhythm, and then we shoehorned another chord in there. Still 4 bars, but I got a 5th chord out of it. So, yes.
Kind of going off what you said, what if you have like a 6-chord phrase, but you supplied maybe 2 of the chords, and they have to connect them?
I hadn't tried that, not with this particular kid, but now I'm gonna file it away. Dr. Dusman.
Neighboring. Neighboring.
Chords or melody?
Oh.
Okay. So
if we're back in the 8 bars,
Mhm.
okay, say, okay, measure 4 ends on dominant. You have to end on dominant so that you can then measure 8 on your time.
yeah, the antecedent consequent phrase worked really well with him because he's an engineer and he thinks about this structure. He just wasn't able to make it happen on its own. Yes.
Similar to the suggestion about you coming up with 2 of the chords, a sort of interpolative process. So if you have this chord and you have X number of chords to get from one to the other. Like a Boulez interpolation.
Yeah.
It doesn't need to be tonal.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Or Chopin.
Okay, so that gets us to, since we have very limited time, that gets us to the 3rd part of this process. How will you support it? If I ask this student to do that thing, they don't have the technique playing on the piano because they're operating from an improvisatory space. They can't make this happen in their hand. So now I have a different problem. In order to make that happen, what do I need to do when I'm structuring their lesson to get that to work? So if you're in that space, you have this goal. It's a good goal for the student, but you know they have a gap. So now I have a lesson that I can teach. I make a plan for how I can support getting them from A to B. So this is our goal. I want them to do this, and you've chosen interpret. Is that also the activity you've chosen, or is there a smaller activity that I can pull out of that? If I say that's the goal, is there a smaller activity that I can show this student, and then we see one, we do one, he goes home and practices it and brings me one next week, and now he's at least nominatively got that skill.
I mean, I can just would be breaking it down into smaller chunks, like 2 chords he's familiar with, or they're familiar with and like playing.
Right.
Like find a way to get between them that one you haven't done before, or that involves the moving of one finger at a time, or moving in a certain direction. Do you have something else more specific?
Well, that's exactly right. So here's the question that I want to put in your brain for that. This student hasn't done that before, and maybe they're not already hearing that in their own head, so they're not resonating with this idea as an improviser who likes to make songs that are in this 4-chord loop. So I need to encourage them to expand their mental palette to include that. So this might not be the place to do it for as I'm just thinking out loud about what you're saying. I might actually need to step away from the composition application right now and step back into that creative bucket and give them some listening and give them some repertoire to interact with, and let that kind of percolate into their own creative hearing before they can successfully apply it. Because where this kid got off the train is every time I asked him to do something that he had not already internalized, right? He could do it in the lesson, but he wouldn't go do it on his own because it wasn't in his headspace yet. And Alyssa had your hand kind of up, and and this might be the last one, but yeah.
I had 2 ideas. One was like providing a baseline or something so that he has to, build something on top of something that's already built. And then the other one with the idea of like prolongation is maybe you give him 2 chords, and then he has to fill 1 in the middle, and then 2 in the middle, and then 3 in the middle, and then 4 in the middle. We can literally do anything that we can think of as composers. And then the trick for making it stick, this is what I have seen in my studio, is that especially with these kids who are in this really early stage of having, a lot in their box to work with, if it's not already in there, it's, maybe they're going to grab everything you give them. Maybe they're not. So that first 2 steps of the process of thinking, where is my kid at that I'm teaching, and what do I want them to do? And then having all of these choices for how I can approach it. I want to have a plan A, I want to have a plan B, and I want to have a really well-marked path that I can follow to get them there. And I actually, I'm going to just escape out of this and go to this one other thing here. There was some possibility that I was going to get crickets in the room. And if I had gotten crickets in the room, and this is very small and I couldn't make it any larger, I had a version of that blank worksheet that had some tips on it. So if I scroll up, if I pick a goal, maybe the goal is elaborating the melody. Maybe it's developing a motive. Maybe it's reharmonizing. It can be very small. And then what am I going to do to get you there? I'm going to use an existing song. We're going to vary the bass line for 8 bars. We're going to do the thing that Alyssa said. I don't know your name in front of Alyssa, but we're going to do this interpolation activity. So I'm going to do this one thing, and then I'm going to plan my support so that this student is going to get to the goal and experience that success. And here we are.
Thank you so much. We have a time for 2 questions.
1, 2. Oh, you want this?
Not really much of a question, just a comment, kind of on the same idea of like
like prolonging a bass line. Have you ever used an app called ChordBot? I have a very 18th century skill set in my studio. It's this great app I've used in my classes before, where basically you put in a bass line, but a chord progression with like, it gives you a limited number of chords depending on like what scale you choose, and it plays it back for them. So if this student plays clarinet, it can just play it back, and you can choose different like styles and whatnot, and then they can improvise on that and internalize that feeling of maybe a 5-bar, 6-bar, 7-bar phrase as opposed to constant 4, 4, 4, 4 over and over again. So thoughts on that, or just I don't know.
Well, I have not tried it, but I will now explore it, and I'm going to write it down as soon as I get to the back of the room.
I just had a clarifying question, which is that the thing you were talking about, which I think is quite interesting, is like is sort of what you're getting at with the finding the way of like giving them tools, but they don't quite grasp them. Is it that? And I found this too. Sometimes people need to sort of come up with the idea in their own head for them to actually start like building upon it and processing it. Is that sort of what you're saying? Is like there needs to be a self-discovery before the technical sort of...
Are we talking about my crazy cartoon slide with the yellow box?
I didn't know what I thought we were talking about sort of what we were just talking about, but maybe we're talking about that too.
So when I was talking about giving a student a bigger tool set to use for their for their composition, maybe this kid's already thinking about making music, but maybe they're not already thinking about making original music. And when I'm teaching them music theory, these are all tools that we would use as composers, right? So every time I teach a new music theory element, I have an opportunity to do something that introduces making original music. And then, some kids are never going to come in and say, I want to do something new. Some kids, you're going to have to push them through every little improvisation or every little variation activity. But some kids are going to say, oh, wait, this is a thing I can do. That's really all I was getting. I was manufacturing as many opportunities as you can.
Cool, thanks.
Cool.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.